which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and been diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry album, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, which was all that was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" "I am." "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. Things that you will see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us." Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him here. "Your welfare. Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to his pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at the time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication. "I am mortal and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, "and you shall be upheld, and more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall, and stood in the business of a city. It was the thoroughfares and busyness of the city was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that were here too. It was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? Was I apprenticed here?" They went in at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that, if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart, it's Fezziwig, alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebeneezer, Dick!" A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self, a young man came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "My fellow apprentice, bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebeneezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Clear away, my lads, and have lots of room here." Clear away? There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or could have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed away as if it was dismissed from public forevermore. The floor was swept, watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Ms. Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid, with her cousin the baker. In came the cook, with her brother's particular friend the milkman. They all came in one after another, some shy, some bold, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, pulling. In all they came, anyhow and every how. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again. As soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and, shaking hands with every person as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back of the shop. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. 3 or 4, perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated up by the remark and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toll. Say that his power lies in words and looks, and things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" "Nothing particular." "Something, I think." No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick." This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again he saw himself. He was now older, a man in his prime of life. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes there were tears. "It matters little, to you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and it can comfort you in time to come, as it would have tried to. I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" "A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then? Even I have grown so much wiser. What then? I am not changed towards you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement?" "In words, no, never." "In what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end. If you were free today, tomorrow, can I even believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? Or choosing her, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were." "Spirit, remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost, "that they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge screamed. "I cannot bear it. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." As he struggled with the spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Stave 3. The second of the three spirits. Scrooge awoke in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that, but it and his own adjoining sitting room, into which he shuffled in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. Walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. Leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that petrification of a hearth had ever known. or for many, many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and great bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge, as he came peeping round the door. Come in, know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the like of me before. Never. Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years? Asked the Phantom. I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800. A tremendous family to provide for, Spirit. Conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons which are cheap, and make a goodly show for 6pence. And she laid the cloth assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable park. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbled up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother Tiny Tim and Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha, mother, cried the 2 younger Cratchits. Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and had to clear away this morning, mother. Well, never mind so long as you're come, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down by the fire, my dear, and have a warm Lord bless ye. No, there's father's coming, cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide. So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob with a sudden declination in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from the church, and had come home rampant. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only for a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit when she had rallied Bob on his credulity and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice trembled when he told them this, and he trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and came back Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded a hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, stirred it round and round, and put it in the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. At last the dishes were set and the grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit looked slowly all along the carrying knife, preparing to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah! There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked." Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last, yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses to take the pudding up and bring it in. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper, a smell like a washing day. That was the cloth, a smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quarter of ignited brandy, and bedlight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour, but everybody had said something about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as gold in goblets would have done, and Bob served it with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all of the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. Tiny Tim sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Scrooge raised his head speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of this feast. The founder of the feast indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it. My dear, said Bob, the children, Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, said she, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, said Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after heart. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, a full 5 and 6pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars as if he were deliberating what particular